Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Esoterica. I'm Leah Eichler.
I'm Susan Cato.
And today we are going to discuss our latest in our series, still a classic, Jane Eyre.
By Charlotte Bronte.
So, Sue, are you a Bronte fan?
I am only a Charlotte Bronte fan.
Okay.
Famously, you and I have argued over Wuthering Heights in the past.
That's true.
By Charlotte's sister, Emily. But I need to reread that, and perhaps in a future episode, I will revisit the opinion I formed when I was like 20.
Right. Okay, fair enough. Maybe that'll be on our next to-do list. So Jane Eyre. So Jane Eyre was published remarkably 176 years ago. Now that sounds almost obscene.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Right? So 176 years ago, it was very political at the time. It was very controversial for a lot of reasons, right?
Yes, and it was also wildly popular, but it was controversial among people who really objected to the same things that might rile up some people and thrill other people today, such as a woman really addressing the class system in a way that sort of says, just because I'm lower class than you, and because I have no money, and because I'm little and poor, I'm not going to let myself be crushed by rich dudes.
Right. And it was also an era where they were tackling not only, well, I guess I feel like we were eternally tackling women's rights, but the idea of income disparity. And I mean, people like the main character, Jane Eyre, who is a governess, is really, comes from wealth, but really is at the mercy of families around her, read into that the men around her to really take care of her. Otherwise, she would end up in the poorhouse. This is a threat that comes up quite a bit.
And we literally see a stage of the novel where she is out in the world with no money, and what she has to do she literally almost dies because she has to beg for food and people don't want to give it to her. She has to sleep outside because people won't give her shelter. And everyone thinks she's up to something nefarious and bad. And this is, even though she looks like she's dressed well, she looks like a lady, but in that world, money and status and friends, as they refer to your family and the people that support you, are everything. Without them, a woman is in a lot of danger.
Really in a lot of danger. So let's do a quick synopsis. Jane Eyre, the first big chunk of the book tackles Jane Eyre up until the age of about 10, when she's residing with her aunt, and who's known as her benefactress. Not really her aunt by marriage, and her 3 children. So her parents died tragically when she's a child. She's too young to remember them, as she lives with her aunt and her cousins, and she's already treated very differently.
Yes, they make a point of saying, you are nothing, you're not our sibling, you have nothing, you're here by our mother's charity. The mother made a promise on her husband's deathbed that she would look after Jane, but she has resented it every second. But what's interesting is everyone says it's because Jane's a bad child, because she is a judgmental child, and because she's a scowling child. And they feel watched by her because they can't love her and she can't love them. And there's a really interesting section early on where she's like, why should I love people who are not nice to me? And her friend, in the second section of the book, when she is in a boarding school that is meant to inculcate Christian values, her friend is saying, well, we have to follow in the example of Jesus. We have to love those who are bad to us. And she's like, why? We don't.
Well, it's interesting because so much of it is a critique of these apparent or these supposed Christian values. Yes. I mean, these Christian values, as presented in the book, are really at odds with any ability to actually live. You're supposed to really degrade your body to the point of possibly death, and even embrace death if that is what the Lord above wishes. To the point, to such an extreme point that it's devastating to read.
You could have an entire conversation just about Christianity in the book, because some of the worst hypocrites and most cruel people are, religious practitioners. But at the same time, Jane's relationship with, God as she sees him is so important to her.
That's correct. So, that's really true.
Very interesting. Just not meditated through a clergyman.
Right. So there's this really interesting scene, and which she recounts later on in the book to Mr. Rochester. This is when she's at school. It's one of her first days, and the gruel that's presented for breakfast is burnt to the point where even the starving girls can't eat it. And they go hungry, and they're already cold, and they already don't have enough warmth or sustenance to really keep them alive and fight off disease, which ends up killing at least half of them. And she recounts that incident as, one of the many cruelties she endured at the school. And even later, it's almost thrown back in her face as, really, that's the worst you could think of? That's the worst you could come up with? But I mean, it's when you think of these young girls, I mean, right now, with our 21st century eyes, to treat young children who've lost their parents and to barely give them any food, and to take joy in the fact that their food is burnt to the point where it should be served as a lesson to them in abstinence, it's horrific.
There are scenes that really play on this. The minister in charge of the girls' religious education has decided they should not care about frivolous things like their looks and their curly hair. And curly hair was very much in style. Oof. He goes ballistic over seeing a woman with curly hair, a girl, when he has forbade it. And they're like, well, her hair is naturally curly. And he's like, no good. You have to cut it all off. Like, it's horrible. It's horrific. I just couldn't even believe how it's like a really graphic book.
Is. And, and I think that's actually what stunned me reading it, 25 or so years later, is I didn't realize how much of a activist and book it was, and how much it tackled social issues that are still relevant 176 years later. I remember thinking remembering more as the love story, and will she or won't she, marry Mr. Rochester, and what. I don't remember, and actually, the majority of the book is really not taken up with the love story.
No, and when you pick up the book again, which I hope you do, just power through, because the first time I picked up the book again, about 5 or 6 years ago, I found the part in the school so painful and cruel that I was like, I can't even listen to this. And then when we were going to do the book again, I listened to it again. And when I say listen, it's because the version of the book that I highly love is on Audible. It's read by Tandy Newton, and it is incredible. Like, you may know her from Westworld or Mission Impossible or Beloved. She really sinks her teeth into this book. So it's unabridged, fantastic experience to listen to it that way. But I'm just saying it takes a long time to get to the love part. And it's actually such a small part of the book. But that, again, like you, I was like, oh yeah, that's the story of Jane and Mr. Rochester. And I remember how that ends,
So the interesting thing is, one of the things I'd love to tackle about this book is it's the origin story of, a symbol that you and I talk about a lot. And that's the idea of this mad woman in the attic. And there have been books written about, supposed mad women in the attic. And of course, it's not really mad. I mean, sometimes they are, but really it's a reference to women's self-autonomy and women's anger. And, it's very fascinating because didn't remember, almost the very first scene in the book is Jane as a very young child being locked in an attic, an attic type room, and having a near death experience and feeling the spirits of her dead uncle kind of penetrate her. So so what do you think about this whole mad woman in the attic now that you've read it again?
It's an indicator. Like, she basically starts off the book by saying, lock someone up like this and they could go mad, which
they do.
Forces you to think about the mad woman in the attic in a different way. And you were saying that you are influenced by reading Wide Sargasso Sea. So again, another book that I'd love to bring up and that we should do a classic on is Wide Sargasso Sea, which is almost if I remember correctly, again, it's been 25, 30 years. It's a rebuttal almost, or it tells Bertha's perspective. Now, Bertha is, of course, this mad woman in the attic. She is Mr. Rochester's first wife that Jane hears, laughing in the hallways, and she's not quite sure where the sound is coming from. And she is this woman who is mad, according to her husband, and therefore locked in the attic, someone he married against his will, so he says.
and locked up. And Why Sargasso Sea, if I remember correctly, and we should go reread that book, is told from Bertha's perspective.
And it's by Jane Eyre, and it was probably written, what, the 60s?
I believe so. I believe so. But it's interesting because Jane is locked up in the room, which really foreshadows what we're about to encounter later on about this idea. And really, when you think about it, this is a book about women being cloistered in different environments. They're cloistered by religion. They're cloistered by society. I mean, Jane goes from really one prison to another. There's a prison in her aunt and uncle's, her aunt or benefactress's home. She's in school where she's in prison, where for years she barely goes outside of the walls of the school. And then she becomes a governess, where again she's almost locked in this, yes, beautiful estate, but locked in nonetheless. So I mean, these prisons just get smaller and smaller, and Jane really, I mean, in her essence, really doesn't want to be locked up.
People seek to control her throughout the novel, and what's interesting is how hard she fights against it, and the way she fights against it in some ways in the pivotal scenes with Rochester, when, I don't want to give away the plot, but when he's asking her to do something she really doesn't want to do, the only freedom she really has is to say no, and protect herself, and to literally flee into, you know, the cruel world outside. And then what does she do? She encounters more men another man who tries to control her, St. John, who is a missionary and a very handsome man of God, who is nonetheless like cold and has basically cut out his own heart, loves a girl that he won't marry because she won't make a good missionary's wife, insists to Jane that she should marry him because she was not formed for love. She was formed for labor, and would make a good missionary's wife. And there's this crazy line where she's like, she's sure he would, you know, fulfill the marriage contract to the utmost, but with absolute unfeeling, where you're like, this is going to be like, he's going to be like, now it is time to do my marital duty and get you pregnant and whatever. But like, he has no love for her, and she knows it. And again, the only power she has is to say no. But what I love about the book is it doesn't come easily to her to say no. She goes through the psychological drama that I thought was so modern, about all the things you think when someone wants something from you, and you would love to make them happy, but it's going to come at too high of a cost to you. And like psychologically, this is an incredibly modern and, to me, true book in the sense of true to human nature, the struggles that she goes through.
Well, it's interesting because even that moment, you know, reminds me of the scenes earlier on with her young cousins who abuse her. I mean, she's meant to let them abuse her. I mean, that society and her predicament would say, let them abuse you and go about it with a smile, because that is your position in society. You are not only a girl, you're a girl of unfortunate circumstances, and you should take it you should take our abuse with glee. And I think that is the interesting thing. And that's where the classism and the sexism really comes out. And she's considered haughty only because she wants to do something as human as defend herself. And really, women are not meant to defend themselves. I mean, her best friend at school really does not defend herself. And what happens? But she dies very quickly into their friendship, because she takes it like a good Christian woman, and that is her demise, really.
And Jane is asked, and, you know, some people are like, you call this a love story because he is a sadistic,
he really is,
jerk. And he's a classic, he like negs her. He tells her she's, you know, she's unattractive, she's poor, no one could care about her. But he also asked her, do you think I'm handsome? And she right away was like, no, not at all. And she's just being honest. So they have this, you could call it banter, but because of the power differential, a lot of people are like, he is so cruel. How could she actually love someone who's so cruel to her? But
well, she actually does say it in her mind. She says, I think he forgets that he pays me 30 pounds a year to take care of his charge. And so the dynamic is different. So she is very straightforward. She's not flirtatious. She's not trying to win him over, because she's very aware of her position in society. And she's straightforward and she's honest. And he wants something out of her that she can't possibly give him at the beginning, because you know, her role is to be dutiful.
And then what is fascinating is by the end of the novel, you get to a situation where she does become financially independent, And the first thing she does is not be greedy, is share it with other people when she is under no obligation to do so. And so I love that about her. But she's like, well, I have enough for me. So to her, it's still plenty. But she's so excited about how she has her freedom. And she's so excited to buy the freedom, especially of her two female cousins who have been out as governesses and, you know, hate that. So now she can free them. And when she does make the choice to return to Rochester, it is on quite different terms. So you could say, well, would it have been a romance if it had ended with her marrying him originally? I mean, it's a much more satisfying, equal relationship by the end. But it is interesting because people do think of it as a romance. But again, you could go down a rabbit hole of people just arguing about, well, is it romantic? Because what a jerk, you know?
Well, I think it's also very typical of an Austen type book to have the man be humbled. I mean, he needs to be humbled before he wins the girl. And we're supposed to really just, you know, admire him for that humbling.
Yes.
And that's when he becomes a suitable partner for the protagonist.
Yeah, I think you're right. When she can come to him on equal terms, she does not need him. She does not need his money. She's there by choice.
So let's talk about this underlying theme, which I think speaks to me and speaks to you. And this is really, I mean, ultimately, let's go back to Mad Woman in the Attic. This is a book about simmering female rage, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of anger in this book. There's an anger of a woman who is in, I mean, we're angry for this child who is in these circumstances. You know, she, you know, Jane doesn't actually get very angry throughout the book. Maybe, you know, early on, she talks back to her aunt/benefactress. Early on, she does encourage her best friend in school to talk back to her abusive teacher. But, you know, we don't sense that her anger is all encompassing. Now, the anger of, although we don't really get enough of a background into it, because this is all told through Jane's perspective, the background of Bertha is an all encompassing anger.
Yeah.
So that's like female rage writ large, right?
And it's so clearly targeted, you know, towards her husband, who she tries to kill. It's towards Jane, whose bedroom she invades, whose wedding veil she rips in half. I mean, I love that someone wrote a book about Bertha because she kind of begs for that extra explanation of what happened with this lady. And the funny thing is, Rochester truly believes he's done the kindest thing. He could have done all these other things with her, but keeping her locked in an attic was by far the kindest thing. He didn't want her to die, so he didn't send her away to a different estate where the air wasn't good and she might have, you know, got a cold and perished.
See, but even if you say that, I don't believe it one bit. So, you know, it's and it's not because the wise are also see, but because, you know, this is told from Jane's perspective, and Jane, I think, does like to look at the best in people in some cases. So I don't think, I mean, do you really believe Rochester had the best intentions? I don't know. I'm skeptical, maybe because that's my modern day Leah brain thinking.
I think that he felt that he was the victim here.
Right.
He's like, I'm the victim here. My dad made me marry this lady and she was crazy. And so I can't marry anyone else. Any woman worth having won't have me. So I have to console myself with a series of opera girls and other mistresses. And then this I'm sucked in by the book every time, but with every rereading, I just love, if you like a flawed character, this is definitely the book for you.
Yeah, no, he's certainly flawed. And, the interesting thing about Jane, is that she is a plain Jane. She's a plain Jane. She says that she's plain. We don't know. Maybe she's actually quite attractive, but no one's ever told her that. And she's not allowed to have airs about herself, but she's supposed to be this every woman. And she's fine with it. She's fine. Yeah. She's absolutely fine with being exactly who she is.
And Rochester's not attractive, but the sexual tension between them really is palpable throughout the book.
That's true.
And you definitely get a strong feeling, especially when she's contrasting it with the bloodless St. John, who is trying to get her to marry him to serve the purposes of God, knowing that she'll probably die the second she steps foot in India because she just doesn't have the constitution for it. I think that it's also a powerful depiction of passion, which again accounts for both its popularity and its controversy at the time of its publication.
Right. But there's so it's, the interesting thing about that is in every instance in the book, when you followed your passion towards, your religious calling, it almost always ends in death. right?
Yes. Well, look at Clarissa, big influence on her. I was listening to something about the books that were in the Bronte home growing up, and no Jane Eyre. I mean, sorry, no Jane Austen, and Charlotte Bronte famously kind of dismissed Jane Austen, for which I
okay, so
this do not like.
This is the origin of the Bronte about the Bronte.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to go there because she may have had her reasons, but they can't possibly be good ones. But she did have Samuel Richardson in her house, and Richardson was a huge influence on Austen as well. But in his two big books, Pamela and Clarissa, in both, women are held hostage in homes by rich and powerful men.
Correct.
And in Pamela in particular, she's in love with her master. It's very similar. She's literally like a housemaid, and he's in love with her. She gradually becomes in love with him, but she won't become his mistress. And it's a pivotal part of the book. So I don't know what my point was there. Oh, but it's the same idea that, like, well, my soul is
correct.
You may be my social equal. So social superior, our souls are equal.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. That's a really fair point. So 176 years later, you know, what also struck me is how women's rights have only really inched along in that time, you know, and maybe inched back. I mean, we just passed the anniversary of the overturning of Roe versus Wade, where women were, you know, again, we have faith combating women's autonomy, which is a big theme in the book. And, you know, things, you know, the more things change, the more things stay the same.
Yeah,
right?
There's a real judgmentalness that Jane is subject to throughout. The second Rochester is interested in her, you can see her kind of friend, the housekeeper, becoming very suspicious of Jane. Like, what if you are a fallen woman? And in the times when Jane is on her own, people don't help her because they think, well, maybe, I mean, it's very clear. They think, well, you've probably been a bad woman.
Right.
And, you know, she's treated like there is a good woman who does one thing, and there's a bad woman who does anything, you know, else. So,
but people always want to see her as bad. I mean, when her first encounter with Rochester, you know, he accuses her of essentially casting a spell on him so that his horse and carriage fell, which is interesting that he accuses her of deception when he was actually the deceiver, because he never mentioned who he was throughout their meeting. And there's that, you know, women, even the purest of souls, are always suspect.
Yeah. And
that makes me really angry.
It really does. And it is interesting to see. You could also just look at the book from the maturation of a character, because we've talked about how angry Jane was as a girl about this terrible, unfair treatment. You have an entire scene where she goes back and visits her aunt when her aunt is dying. She sees the two of the three children that tormented her, and the other one has died a terrible death. She finds it in her heart to have a little compassion for him, but she finds it in her heart to have a surprising amount of compassion for her aunt, who she had said earlier, I'll never.
But not only that, her aunt also deceived her out of money.
Oh my God, yes.
So I mean, she really has no reason. So Jamie is she's the opposite of a flawed character. I mean, if anything, she proves herself again and again to be above and beyond what is expected, I think, of a human. Yeah. And it's still never enough, you know, which is kind of, you know, brings me back to today. Like, it's never enough, right?
No, it really isn't. You can be as good as possible. People will always find you lacking, and there'll always be, you know, society ready to blame you, and maybe a jerky man to fall in love with. Now, when I think about it, sometimes I'm like, come on, you would never get over being lied to the way she was. Someone who literally take you to church and was willing to marry you when you didn't know they were already married. And, you know, of course, there were huge religious taboos at that time about, you know, having sex outside of marriage, which this really would have been.
Yeah.
But, you know, even now, without those taboos, imagine that a person doing that to another person, and you would be like, they're dead to me.
Yeah.
Or your friends would be like, but here's Jane's lucky because she doesn't have family or friends that are going to say you can never go back. That's the other thing that's really interesting. One of the only areas of independence that she mentioned several times is that she doesn't have family that will care for her. And that's also something Rochester says, you don't have family to worry about you. And I love that, because he's planning to do this thing. And if he gets caught, he knows there's no brother or father that's going to come after him, challenge him to a duel, which would have been a really logical thing to do when something like that happened to a woman in your family.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the lack of family also let her think more independently than she may have been able to think had she been raised with, you know, a father and brothers.
In Rochester's defense, he does say that he planned 1 year after the marriage to tell her everything.
1 year.
Yeah, by which point she would have been pregnant or had a child and would not have had any choice in the matter of staying with him or not.
Yeah, that does also seem kind of, you know, sus. No?
I'd want everyone to reread it and make the decision for yourself.
Yeah, not a nice guy. I don't know. So maybe nay on love story, but yes on the female range for me.
Oh, fantastic.
How about for you?
Yay on the depiction of human nature.
Right.
The absolute clear-eyed dissection of different types of people and different types of behavior is unparalleled.
It really is.
Yeah.
I mean, such a meticulous analysis. It's almost like waking up 176 years ago and seeing what the world is like.
And I think you could say, you know, her choices are self-sabotaging, but she's not meant to be a role model. And I love that because so many women in fiction before that were meant to be role models. I mentioned Richardson and his heroines, Pamela and Clarissa. They literally were supposed to be perfect. That was the author's intention. And the readers were supposed to see a perfect woman behaving perfectly in strange situations. And I think that Jane Eyre's like, you know, doesn't go there. And Charlotte Bronte was probably like, perfection's not realistic.
Right. I think that's pretty accurate. Okay. So should we come up with our judgments?
It's a real
I know this is a tough
nail biter here.
I know it's a tough one. And I know it's hard to say. I mean, so we're going to divorce the idea that this is a classic in the sense that, yes, of course it's a classic because 176 years later, we're still reading it and still in print. But would it be written today and well received today for someone who's never read it before? And that's how I'm going to look at
that's
the
classic.
What I'm looking at it. Okay. So let's say, is this still a classic?
1,
3.
2. Oh, sorry.
Let's do 3. Let's do.
Okay.
3, 2, 1. Okay, that wasn't a huge surprise, but you know, we both love Jane Eyre.
And if you are an Audible subscriber, you can actually get the Tandy Newton reading of it. It's included with an Audible subscription, or you can buy it. I get no money from this, but I tell everybody to get it because it's probably, along with The Great Gatsby read by Jake Gyllenhaal, one of like the 2 best audiobooks in the whole Audible system.
Okay, so you can actually listen or read it, but we hope you do. And until next time, thank you for tuning in, and bye for now from Esoterica.